It's such an honor to be here at Chicago Humanities Festival, and especially to be on stage with Vivien Goldman. I'm going to start with a very short little story. I was 16 years old. It was 1979. I was in Iowa City, which for me was a little bit of a prison-like situation, given that I was fixated on British music. And I was lucky to have an outlet for it because we had a little pharmacy that catered to the university crowd by bringing in the British music press. So New Musical Express, Sounds, these amazing magazines came in a week late. So I lived vicariously in London via Iowa City a week late. And I started seeing a name over and over again that I noticed was maybe the smartest of the writers, also happened to be one of the only women writing, and that was Vivien Goldman. I was 16 years old reading Vivien Goldman, and she was consistently fantastic. And then a couple years later, I went to college, and the summer before I went to college, I was always in the record store, and I noticed a record that had a similar name, Vivien Goldman, and I thought, could that possibly be the same person? And it had other people associated with it that I really liked. And so I bought it and fell in love with it, and this is what it sounded like if we could hear Laundrette by Vivien Goldman.
I wanted 10 pence for the dryer. Yes, that was how we met. My laundry bag was broken. My clothes were soaking wet. I felt I needed hugging. You needed board and lodging. I can't complain, we went down the drain. Seems like I can't get away from you. Even in the laundrette. Seems like I can't get away from you. Even in the laundrette. Now my socks are your socks in the dryer.
It's hard to do this, but we're going to keep the clips short. But I am once again 16 and sitting, or I guess I was 18 and sitting in Iowa City and listening to you.
And it just goes to show how times have passed, because last week that very tune was on HBO's The Deuce. So that was the weirdest small little underground record I put out myself, distributed by Rough Trade. So, I mean, it is a good time to reassess the 70s and early 80s. You know, it's that rhythm where it's just sort of coming round again, which is actually something me and John have been discussing, how the zeitgeist at the moment does, in a way, reflect that feeling that the Sex Pistols spoke about with Anarchy in the UK, because it's kind of, you know, there's that vertiginous feeling. I've been in London quite a bit lately. There's that vertiginous feeling where everything is completely chaotic and there's no sense of certainty, and it's a culture whose identity is completely fractured right now. You know, as I was saying in a talk there, if we're not Europeans in terms of Brexit, then really who are we as England? And in America, obviously, it's an enormous identity crisis in terms of the betrayal of the Constitution and all the, we're all the huddled masses, aren't we? Or we all were at one stage. And yes, so it's really is a good time to revisit those ideas and ideals of DIY and activism, and somehow making your independent, personality felt when the whole system is structured to, basically make us slaves of our credit cards if we are, quote, lucky enough to get them, and to keep us trotting in a very straight path if we're going to survive. You know, we see that happening more and more. So I think it's a great time to revisit the 70s.
I wonder what were pivotal moments for you in the 70s? I mean, you started writing about music before punk.
Yeah, it was. Actually, that's what does put me in a unique position and enabled me to write this book because, you know, in a way I was so situated to write it partly because I had been on the music press literally sort of about 6 or 8 months before punk began. So I was able to experience it. So I can literally say that punk was an absolute vehicle of liberation for women. And I mean, I'm quoted here, you know, in my own book, I'm quoted, you know, it starts
at
off...
length.
Yes. From something I wrote in 1976 that begins, suddenly there seemed to be an awful lot of women musicians or women bands in the Sounds gig guide. That's because prior to that little moment in 1976, there weren't. So from my personal lived experience, I can pinpoint the start of the revolution. By the way, my CD is actually called Resolutionary. I'm not quite, you know, to call myself a revolutionary, but I am a resolutionary. Yeah.
I think it's interesting to think about the way that punk figured in the arc of the 70s.
Yeah.
Because we tend to think of it as a late 70s phenomenon when it really is a mid 70s phenomenon. It kind of divides the decade.
Bisects, yeah, and it was sort of preceded by glam. But since, you know, the point is that John's book, my book, looks at punk and it takes it from its inception in the 1970s through to the present day and even hopefully pointers for the future. But John, in a very personal and touching way, has revisited a lot of formative pieces of music from the 70s itself. And while we were sort of pottering around, it made me really think, wow, what really was it about the 70s? Well, for a start, it followed the 60s. Okay, so, you know, in the 60s, there was this sense of anything was possible and we were really going to bring about change. And we were coming out of that, quote, stifling conformism of the little boxes 1950s. But then, you know, this is a very brief period on so many levels, you know, including the fact that it's you know, post-penicillin and the pill and pre-AIDS. So there was this incredible sense of freedom, you know, physically in the 70s. And also, I can't really speak as much for America, but for sure in the UK, it was the dawn of feminism. And it was legislation starting to happen. You know, as I say in the book, literally, things were happening in that period when punk was beginning. Prior to that, as Leslie Woods from the Au Pairs, who's now an immigration lawyer but was a big punk star, she was reminding me that prior to that, if a woman was being beaten up by her husband, she had no legal recourse. And my big sister Judy, just that pivotal 6 years older than me, she's sort of still annoyed because she's like, when I was coming up, we could not buy a house or a car or anything unless you had a convenient, like, mail to sign for you. So, yeah, we're talking about still more jaundiced than the 60s, but still a period of both turmoil and optimism. And I think this does come out in the music, because the 80s was where everything really changed, and you had to have a big philo fax and a portable phone the size of a telephone book and so on, you know, and it became very materialistic. But the 70s, which produced the songs that you talk about in your book, you know, how would you describe it? Let me kick it back to him.
Well, I look at I think there are these cycles, and some of the cycles are put in motion by people getting frustrated, and some of them are also cycles that, in the 70s, we went through one full cycle of concentration of power and decentralization and of or centralization of power and kind of less diversity in output at the beginning of the 70s, which in part led to this crash in the music industry. And it wasn't actually a crash. It was perceived...
Early 80s crash.
It was just before. It was in 1978. The market actually leveled off for the first time ever. I was working in a record store, 78, 79, and so I was, I was a little kid, but I did manage to convince a record store to let me sell bongs for them and also sell a few records. And I remember I tell this story in the book, but I remember my boss coming in one day and cracking open a bunch of records and flapping a Joni Mitchell record around because they were so cheaply made. They were so thin you could almost see through them. And he said, the industry is terrified. This industry is going to die right now. And it was because nobody was buying LPs anymore. And it wasn't really because they weren't. It was because a market that had been going astronomically up leveled off. And
saturation?
It was a sort of saturation. It was also that they were used to making enormous amounts of money and then spending it on their lavish dinosaur rock bands. And so what ended up happening was they got terrified and they stopped all of the programs that they had to kind of look out. All the A&R people pulled in, the artists and repertoire people pulled in, and they only actually produced records by a much fewer number of people. So the 80s was characterized by the larger record labels not being diverse. What happened is the DIY movement took over.
Which is punk, which is the essence of punk.
And that was basically, it predated it by 2 years, but it actually was luckily there because people were making their own records and they weren't looking for big labels to do it for them. So I see it as being this, also having this really interesting economic drive behind it. So it was people taking command, but it was also the market having kind of overshot itself and thought that they were going to be able to sell records forever.
And a greed of the industry, which is really part of what's led to its downfall, because exactly the period you're talking about exactly precedes the arrival of the CD, remember?
Yep.
And that, again, obviously then, I mean, it's funny because now vinyl is hopping again, but that, again, was a big crash of the albums and a big challenge for the industry. But again, the greed, they charged so much for those CDs, didn't they? I can't actually quote you the figures, but what do they charge, like 10 times more than it cost to manufacture? 20? A heck of a lot more they didn't need to, And so it goes, and here we find ourselves now where especially newer, younger consumers feel that music is absolutely their right, free, that they can just download from the skies, and artists are just sort of motoring on air. I'll tell you a little cute story. When I was teaching a reggae course at NYU, and I had all these singles, because Island Records was very famous for its beautiful artwork. So, I had the pink palm tree logo, etc. So one of the students comes up and he picks up this single, and he's sort of looking at it, and he says to me, Professor Goldman, is that what you used to listen to music on? And I said, yeah, there was this thing, a spindle, like and used to that hole in the middle, and then the needle, and it would go round and round. And he sort of thought about it. He said, I don't really like it. He said, I'm used to my music being intangible, and to me, that's how music should be.
Yeah. Well, it's come back around again.
Yes, it certainly has come back around. That kid probably has a record player as we speak, you know.
Maybe we should listen to a piece of music.
Oh, sure, it's always fun.
Why don't we listen to, what about a little bit of the Slits?
As I say in the book, a lot of women's songs about identity, perhaps partly because identity was changing so much. This song by the Slits, Typical Girls, is really emblematic of that drive.
You know, one of the things that I think characterized the 70s, also going back, but especially in that period of post-punk, let's say, was a kind of omnivorousness. People were looking around, and I mean, I listened to them. I remember listening to them, having read about them in all of those music magazines as being punks, and then listening to the record when it came out and thinking, this is incorporating reggae, this has got little flourishes that are experimental, that have this kind of beautiful improvised feeling.
Yes. Well, they did have leading improviser Steve Beresford, who also played with me, you know, as part of the Slits. But, you know, you've got to, sometimes when I'm teaching, I have to sort of explain this thing that happened in the UK, because it's really a sort of very British post-colonial phenomenon for some reason. And, you know, but it was a sort of post-war, post-colonial phenomenon in England. The punks felt there was no future, and the Rastas, you know, there was a sort of English version of Stop and Frisk called Sus. So you know, it was very insecure, and there was a revolutionary spirit afoot, and there was a sort of ad hoc connection between punk and reggae. It was a bit of a one-way love affair, because whereas punks did loads of dubs, I have to say you didn't find many reggae bands doing punk songs, but it was, you know, it was from two camps of disenfranchised, disaffected youth. So, you know, it was real in that sense. It's hard to explain well, not hard to explain, but, you know, in America they don't often get it till you explain, you know. But that infuses the Slits, it infuses my work, and it fuses, you know, the work of that whole generation. And I teach a course on this at NYU actually, without that impact of Jamaican dub music, we would not have the EDM scene, we would not have electronic dance, because they were the first people to chant over the mic, chat over the mic, and remix with dub. It was where you remix a well-known song, and you make it completely different by remixing it and making a version. And that was really the dawn of the remix. Ba-boom. Thank you, Jamaica.
Yeah. It's funny because when the early 80s, very late 70s, early 80s, American punk scene had its version of that in the group Bad Brains. But Bad Brains went back and forth between playing reggae and punk, but they did it in a very hard, they didn't mix it very much.
Well, they were the pioneering black punk, Afro-punk band before that Afro-punk thing existed. The revered music journalist Lester Bangs did write an acclaimed article that's now available as a PDF online about the racism in the early punk scene. It was very exclusionary. So there were individuals such as photographer Dennis Morris and DJ and filmmaker Don Letts in the UK. But really, that meshing of punk and reggae was our interracial aspect, and that crossover. But that's why in America they formed the Afro-punk movement.
Yeah, we had a really interesting little-known group in Detroit, actually, called Death.
The legendary Death. Ooh, Death.
Really great band, and they were sort of the era of Iggy and the Stooges.
Yeah, so they were ahead of their time as Afro-punks, and I think they had quite a hard time, didn't they? They didn't have the
Nobody knew about them until 10 years ago.
Until way later, yeah. So, yes, even in punk, that liberation thing at that time, it had a slightly reductive view, but now it's quite different. And I do, in my book, include people like Grace Jones, you know,
Sure.
who is a pioneer of punk. Nobody's punkier than Grace Jones.
One of the things I love, your book is so fantastic, and I love the fact that it's so, I was thinking about commonalities between our books.
Yeah.
They're both sort of playlists.
Yeah, definitely.
Yours is definitely a play. It's set up with playlists at the beginning of each chapter, and it's structured that way. And mine is also a playlist.
It's like one big playlist. Yeah.
And they're both non-linear. They resist simple chronologies. Mine is totally chronological in terms of the records, But some of them are stories from back then, some of them are analyses of now. They kind of jump around in time. But one of the things I love about your book, which is something I strove to do as well, is how international it is and how it looks not to be exclusively about Britain and the United States, but to move around. And we were talking yesterday a little bit about how there were not a lot. That was a feature. That's been a feature of music inspired by punk and post-punk since then, but there was a lot less of it at the time. I chose one piece to play, which is an exception to that, which is by this group called Kleenex, which was always one of my very favorite post-punk bands, all-woman band from Switzerland, from Zurich, Switzerland. Maybe we'll listen to Ain't You. Yeah.
And you wanna get it out? Don't you want to wait wrong? Take a radio in your life, take a radio in your love. Take it in and take it out, take it out wherever you will. Push it in and push it out and push it out. Take a radio in your life, take a radio in your love. And you wanna get it out? Don't you want to wait wrong? Take a radio in your life, take a radio in your love. Take it in and take it out wherever you will. Push it in and push it out and push it in. Take a radio in your life, take a radio in your love. And you wanna get it
All right.
out?
I hate to cut them off. They're so good.
Yeah, they were distributed by Rough Trade, which was a very seminal operation in making the music more female-friendly and also more diverse, because they were also, very much pushed the reggae alongside the punk. But I definitely had an agenda. When the University of Texas approached me after Resolutionary, my CD, and asked me to write something about women and punk, I hadn't thought of doing it. It was their idea. And then I really had to think, do I want to do it? What do I really want to say, etc. And I felt that the punk and our generation, definitely our generation of women musicians and artists had felt, pop is such a fickle medium, so that they always forget every generation. And then after a while, they pick up the slack with these reissues. But at the time, we didn't know about the reissues. We just thought our work was We just thought our work was completely suppressed. And I felt that the suppression of it, was an attack on it having been literally the first generation of females to be able to make self-identified music, self-controlled music their way. And I was absolutely sure that just as Riot Girls had arisen to, 15 years later, that punk was still resonating as a liberator for women around the world. And I just wanted to hear the women's voices. I wanted to hear our commonality and our differences and how we had used music to express our desire for change over the generations, and literally as around the world as I could in a small volume, And can I say that one of the group, I end on this group, Fertile Miseria from Colombia. I literally did go out and research and track down these artists to speak to. It took me 2.5 years, even apart from my own life, just to pull all these people together and find them and speak to them. I have to say that Fertile Miseria sort of confirmed the reasons why, I was so glad I came of age with punk. The ideals, the struggle that punk had articulated for me and made me feel I was not alone. I could see Fertile Miseria doing it in Colombia, which is actually way more of a conflict zone, even than when we were marching in the streets with the Rock Against Racism. So, and when I finally got to talk to them, it was really a big deal tracking them down. And then at first they said, oh no, we can't be interviewed by you because we can only answer as a collective. So I had to wait till they could all meet and send their answers. And then gradually I got to know the sisters at the heart of the band, and on the phone and so on, and over email, because I don't really speak Spanish, unfortunately. But, their own bass player was one of the disappeared, who's, musician who was taken off in what they call a car of death, and they were lucky to get him back. And at their gigs, they collect clothes and food, and they do a lot of work with children of the disappeared and so on, And I saw that they were really living their ideals, and the sort of things they say were so moving to me, Can I just read a little bit? As a band, we saw in ourselves a moral obligation to help and not remain passive in the face of this multifaceted situation in Colombia. At our concerts, we collect food, toiletries, money, and clothes, which are donated to these groups of people at schools and neighborhoods and on the streets where many of them live. We feel that these songs embedded with messages of help that create more solidarity and human consciousness. As bands, we should not only express our experiences, but also do something for our country and our planet. And the music was great. So, I was glad that I met Fertile Miseria and was able to finish with them, because these were the ideals that motivated me as a child of, refugees from the Holocaust myself, as a first-generation person. It was that spirit of punk which embraced the liberating of women. That is what, I don't know what would happen to me if I hadn't come up with punk, because that gave me a community that formed me. So punk is merely one aspect of what you cover in your book. But I would say that it is a bright aspect that gives the decade some of its energy, because he also covers funk and all sorts of stuff I never even listened to at the time, like those American bands. So his is much more eclectic than mine.
What
Journey and whatever. I didn't really listen to it. No disrespect.
There is no Journey chapter in my book. No Journey. There is no Journey chapter.
They were good at their thing. They were good at their thing. It just wasn't what I was into, reggae and dub and jazz, But yeah, you have a fairly, as they say, Catholic mix.
Small C. And there's a chapter about the Clash, and in that chapter, I think I make the proclamation that you can divide the 70s up in a whole bunch of different ways, but whatever you do, there's always before and after punk. And it's basically that was the dividing line. And my experience was that the 70s fell along those lines. And this is, for me, was a book where I went back and actually re-examined some music that I had long ago banished from my life, like Pink Floyd's Animals, which was my favorite record in 1977, and I went to see them on that tour, which was amazing. And then sometime when I was in college and they had put out the record The Wall, I thought, these guys stink. And I threw all of it away. And then by chance I happened to hear it again about 3 years ago in its entirety, and I thought, this is a great record.
It's not that bad after all.
It's pretty great.
But if you look at his book, you see there's such an interesting mix as well, and it includes not only Kiss and Electric Light Orchestra and all that, but also funk and jazz.
Yeah.
So,
Let's listen to Fertile Miseria.
Oh,
Let's hear a little bit of the Fertile Miseria.
That radical group I was talking about from Colombia, has a very moving video on YouTube, which you can see. It's called Visiones de la Muerte.
Say
It's abrasive, really matches their situation. You should watch the video. It's very, very moving. It shows a guy in the ambulance. He's been shot in presumably some like shootout scenario. They don't make it clear, but the anguish of the situation in Colombia at that point is such that he's questioning whether he wants to. They're trying to keep him alive. They're trying to keep him alive, but he's questioning whether he even wants to come back. It's very, very poignant, and that abrasiveness, that pain, is matched in the music, I think.
Yeah, I was thinking a little bit about some of the different ways that punk served as an inspiration as a listener for me. And one of the ways that it served was as a gateway to all kinds of other musics. And one of the musics that it was a gateway to, partially because of its energy and the fact that it could be abrasive, the fact that it could be dissonant, was into certain kinds of jazz. And
post-punk, it was completely impacted by jazz, yeah.
So I thought maybe we could play a little bit of the beginning of a track by the Art Ensemble of Chicago, get a little Chicago music in here, with a singer named Fontella Bass, who was
Over Like a Fat Rat, that Fontella Bass, right?
Yeah.
That's the name of
this
a
is a
disco hit by her.
Amazing track called Theme to Yo-Yo, which was from a soundtrack for a film that they made when they were living in Paris for about a year and a half in 1969-70. And I'll show you this doesn't sound very much like punk, but it has a moment where the music falls apart and then comes back together again in this incredibly miraculous way. And I'm going to wait till that comes, but it's coming soon. Maybe we turn it up. So good, thank you. Your body's like camembert oozing from its skin.
But it's phenomenal, the spread of music that was reaching a peak in the 70s. That's really the thing, with the Art Ensemble of Chicago, with the funk, with the punk, with the reggae, in so many genres. But also, I think we've got to look at it in the context of the time. At that time, like when I started doing music journalism, it wasn't that hard because pop had only been around for a little bit. It didn't take long to become an expert because it had only been going a couple of decades. It's not like now where there's this flood of information, so it must be very hard to keep up. But it's just, at that time, it's also important to remember that music held a position in culture that it no longer holds. Music, like books, it's not like it goes away, but it got challenged, definitely, because all this was pre-computer, pre-internet. So now everybody has loads of ways they can communicate culturally online, this and that and the other. But at that time, music was what we had. Music was all we had. And that's partly why so much creativity went into music. Some of it is now, goes offside into sort of computer games or something, writing computer games or scoring for computer games, But then music and the album, with its narrative aspect over the period of an hour, divided in two by flipping the record, that was our journey. And I think the recent rise that he mentioned in vinyl is because somewhere people miss that. Just
totally
like
agree.
that student, he was like, oh, I prefer it. But then afterwards, I bet he got to thinking and bought a record player, like I said, because people in the end missed that tactile element. And also the textual and graphic potential of a sleeve, even on a CD, compared to just the download.
The interweb.
It's not as rich.
And I think for me, it was always the dynamic of having an A side and a B side.
Yeah.
And because I think it actually comes from theater. I think it's Act 1, intermission, Act 2. And for me, it's always had that sense of turning the record over, being a palate cleanser, and it's well known that the sweet spot on an LP is the first song on the second side. Okay. That's like where all the singles come from. And that's when you're refreshed and you come back and you listen to the second side, and that's where they wanted to place the hot songs. I think we're going to turn to Q&A in a second, but maybe one last topic for 3 minutes of conversation. I was wondering this question came to me thinking about who were the enemies in the music industry in the 70s, from your standpoint?
Oh, I was so naive. I remember writing things about A&R people from the multinationals, and they were so proud to be insulted in my little gossip column, to show they were on. I was very involved with Rough Trade because the guy who founded it actually was my roommate. Okay, so the shop was just around the corner, so I became, really became part of my whole formation and life at that time, and. We were so keen to smash that system, which was so reductive and had let so few voices through, and the thrill of building up the DIY systems. Distribution is always the challenge, as anybody who's tried to make things up. Am I right? Yeah. So, yes, the big companies, as a stupid young punk, I perceived as the enemies, but there is an interplay, isn't there? There had to be an establishment for us to, in our sort of adolescent way, but we did make some change to try and overthrow. Yeah.
My experience was not that in a way. It took a long time for me to understand the power dynamics.
Do you remember how people freaked out when the Clash signed to the big label,
yeah,
CBS?
Sure. Yeah, no, I remember reading that.
It was regarded as a betrayal.
Yeah, but I remember my experience of it was we had basically one punk in Iowa City. He had a very tall Technicolor mohawk, and he came to the record store, and he and I had long conversations about Adam and the Ants and various bands that we were both keen on, and I was playing Yes, and he came in and he said, "Did your boss make you play this?" And I said, "No, this is a great record." And he said, "You cannot listen to Adam and the Ants and Yes. You have to choose." And I said, "Who's making me choose?" He said, "I am." And so that was maybe where I started to get the glimmer of the fact that there were actual us and them in the music industry. But before that, I was just like, another record store owner told me, he said, "You like everything." I said, "No, I don't." He said, "What don't you like?" And then I had to think about it. So discernment came into the picture. Yeah. But, well, maybe we open it up for some questions if people have questions or comments.
Thoughts from the floor. Hang on, shall I pass?
I think there's one right there.
Okay.
Hey everyone, just make sure that we are asking our questions in the form of a question and keeping it brief so we can get to as many people as possible.
Yeah. You sort of touched on this, but what I'm interested in is your opinion about how digital music has changed. I mean, with albums or even with CDs, there was often a narrative arc to the order of the songs. And now with digital downloads, and I find myself guilty of this too, you just, you pull this song from this, you make your playlists, and
Why guilty?
how it's changed.
It's what everybody's doing.
I know, but it certainly, I would think, has changed the creative process for musicians, for groups. And if you could address that, negative, positive, whatever.
The introduction to my first book, which came out in 1994, was a celebration of the shuffle play on the CD, where I thought iPods weren't there yet. I was like, on the CD player, there was a shuffle play, and then I was like, oh my God, this is revolutionary. You could have 5 things that you can choose between, and you don't know what juxtapositions you're going to get. I thought that was amazing and wonderful.
It's almost like a Burroughs cut-up, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. But now, having lived with that for a very long time, 25 years, and also from time to time having that as background to things that I do in the world, I realize if I have it as background, it just turns to mush. So the only time I listen to things with shuffle play or with a kind of randomized access is when I'm paying attention to them. When I'm not paying attention to them, I just put a record on. And I try to listen to the whole, and I can have it on the background and sense the arc of it, but I miss that arc, personally. I really do. I miss that sense of there being a something that someone put together. I try to, when I'm paying attention, I try to pay attention as if there's a DJ, even if it's random. If it's a random play thing, I'll say, yeah, random's not doing a good job right now. Or random's making some great decisions.
Yeah, I think maybe people do approach it in a more fragmented way, perceiving it more as a series of singles. But, there are some auteur types, who definitely still... Because there are still CDs and albums for sale. So, but I think that, the consumer very often takes it in those bite-sized chunks like singles, and that are meant to be complete and gripping in themselves. So I suppose the artists try and deliver that. But I mean, what is more indigenous to popular music than a 3-minute arc, really? Yeah. Person over there. Person over there. Yeah, you. We're trying to get you a mic.
Coming around.
Soon
It's coming to you.
Here it comes. Thank you.
Thank you. You were just talking about us versus them. This is something that people talk about from time to time, but there's a profound lack of definition associated with that in most of those discussions.
Yeah.
For yourself personally, how would you describe the competing or divergent body of ideas represented in the polarities of us and them as you were talking about it?
Well, for me, it would come, at the time, I think it had to do with the us-them that my punk friend was trying to introduce me to, was the us-them of capitalism versus doing it yourself.
That's exactly what I was about to say.
And I think that ended up being the primary, and then all the things that spun out from that, which had to do with capitalism representing someone else telling the musicians what they should do versus doing it yourself, meaning that the musicians did whatever the hell they damn wanted to. So that was and it's very simple. These are simplistic. If you start down the us-them path, you're not being very subtle. But that feels to me like what the gist of that was. I think there are all sorts of other kinds of us-thems as well. I mean, there were ones that had to do within the kind of monster rock era. You have Heart, for instance, which was a very interesting sister band. And then you have all sorts of cock rockers who are doing, and so there's another kind of us-them there that has to do with, I think, in retrospect, looking at the gender politics, and not even necessarily in retrospect, but in the 70s, I mean, Angela McRobbie and Simon Frith wrote very interesting academic work about gender in rock at that time. So those are us, them kinds of situations.
And you know what else, to me, impacts on the whole us and them thing? When you look at it, you can't really divorce it from technology. Because what happened right around then, like I remember I was in this group, the Flying Lizards, and our front cover art was done by Laurie Ray Chamberlain, and he was an early pioneer with color Xerox, using it for art. So that was like a new frisson. We were doing early synth pop, so we were choosing visuals to match this experimentation with technology, you know. But the whole, you know, punk thing really was able to start because the cassette came in. This was the first time somebody could do something at home. I remember how shocked I was when video started happening. I was like, oh my goodness, we can talk back to the TV. And that was with cassettes like My Early Music and loads of us. Some of us, like Swirl Maps, would come out on cassette. Funnily enough, now there's a trend back to cassette, which is as weird as it gets in a way, but pop loves to eat itself. You know, and actually, to be honest, I loved cassettes. I thought they were a great medium. I preferred them to digital myself. I liked it, you know, and if they broke in your bag, if the cassette came out of its box, right, you could take a pen, a biro, and fix it. You can't do that with digital. But of course, digital has its own charms. We can't be too Luddite, so, you know. But I personally was very fond of the cassette, and I'm glad to see it come back.
There's an amazing series of records called Mesthetics. It's 10 different CDs that compile music from the cassette era of punk and post-punk up until about 1984. And they are absolutely fantastic. I mean, some of the music on them is unlistenable, but a lot of it is just unlistenable in a really great way. I mean, I use that, that's a term of endearment for me. But.
It changed so much. Do you remember what it did, like, say, in African music? Even now, they're still excavating all the music that came out in Africa in the 70s, 80s, cassettes only. Actually, you know, it enables so much, you know, direct communication, cassettes. I remember once if we got another second, this is just a little story, you know, I mean, I was in Israel years and years and years ago, and they had this thing called bus station music, which was on cassettes, and it was all a sort of, you know, people coming in from Yemen. It was sort of Arab, early hip-hop and so on, you know, and actually I did a lot of research and found some interesting stories, but check it out, of course. At that time, in the media, there was nobody who wanted to run that story. So, but I still have some of the, you know, very weird and unusual cassettes from that completely forgotten genre of bus station music.
My favorite thing about cassettes was the fact that record labels, record companies were so afraid of them. And they started a little campaign where on a bunch of records, including a lot of great punk and post-punk records, there would be a little sign on the back of them that said, it had a cassette, a tape, and then a skull and cross, like crossbones, with the cassette tape holes as eyes. And it said, home taping is killing music. Yeah. And my favorite response to that was in a little record store in New York, where there was a bumper sticker on the back wall that said, home fucking is killing pornography. Pardon my French.
Yeah, because the lunatics were taking over the asylum, you see.
Exactly.
Except that it was the lunatics who actually had the connection with the creativity. And the asylum was the people who wanted to say, as we were just saying, charge so way much more to the consumer than at that point the CD cost to make. They were just sort of, had this sort of ruthless, vampiric attitude. And, you know, now they've had to deal in the industry with many more changes and challenges with the digital. But my argument is if the industry had been more hip to the digital at the start, it wouldn't have been such a sort of collapse. And also if they hadn't been so greedy in that sort of, what do they call that, extra rapacious capitalism. that uber capitalism, then, then
ERC.
Yeah, the people might have had more faith in the whole idea of actually going and plonking down their hard-earned for a couple of tunes. Yeah.
Maybe we take one more question? Yeah.
Lady over there, in the hip beret. Yes, beret wearers must stick together.
Can you describe your very, very first awakening to an awareness of reggae?
Wow, well, it's funny because they're actually selling a couple of rare copies of my Bob Marley Exodus book out there. But yeah, reggae came to really dominate my life personally. And, reggae and dub became the filter through which I viewed and lived so much. And yes, I do really remember, because I remember that when I was a kid, there would be a couple of reggae songs on the radio, but it would, they would always be novelty singles. And then Millie came along, My Boy Lollipop, and that got in the charts. And that was sort of a bit novelty, but also good music, And then when I was a student, it was that time Miles Davis on the corner experimenting with funk, and the Wailers doing the first ever, as we were talking about, narrative arc in their albums for Island Records, for the international market. And I remember really loving things like, Catch a Fire then. But then I got a gig, very simple. I got a job when I was just out of university doing PR at Island Records, and I was given their reggae. That was my personal responsibility. So, and then also by chance, I lived in this very Caribbean area where the West Indian Carnival happened. I've got to be honest, who knew that at that time that was going to be like my best ever social life, okay? That is the reality. Because there was all these shebeens, like reggae clubs, and they were illegal, because at that time with the racism, you couldn't be a young black entrepreneur and go and get a club in the West End, like the Millionaire's Mile. It just wasn't going to happen. So people would seize these squats and, abandoned places and bring their big speakers in, and that would be the party. And I was a regular at my favorite one. There was about 5 of them by me. You could go and you could pay like 50p or a quid, and you could be rocking all night with your nutriment or your baby sham, and they would sell some other meditational items too. And what I always remember, this one Weasel's shebeen that was under the Westway, and that's where the Clash and the Slits and Aswad and Steel Pulse and everybody would sort of get together, and that was a very long-running shebeen, and it was 3 minutes walk from my house. And the only way they stopped that shebeen was the owners of the house, which was an abandoned house that had been taken over, and this dance had been running for like years. The owners finally came in and they chopped up the floor. So when they came in to try and open the club, whoops, no floor. So, that's what it took to stop that party. But then in the end, garage music came in, grime and all that. The Jamaican music was of that era, which was at such a height, was absolutely definitive for the whole future of popular music. Absolutely set the directions, there's no doubt. John?
Yeah, mine's much shorter. Only because that's an extraordinary, I hear that and I think, oh my God, going to participate in those things. So my first experience of reggae was one of two radio experiences. I don't remember which came first. It was either hearing Paul Simon's Mother and Child Reunion, or it was hearing I Shot the Sheriff by Eric Clapton, that was probably the game changer. I think that's what it was. I think hearing that on the radio and probably saying to someone sitting near me, what is this? What kind of music is this? And so it was the difference between coming...
There wasn't a big Jamaican expat community where you were living, was there?
At that time, it was in Philadelphia. It was in a suburb of Philadelphia. No, I didn't know where Jamaica was. For sure, I didn't know. So You know, this is a
That's
really
why
interesting
I say it's
difference.
a post-colonial story.
Yeah.
And all these years I've been like teaching the punky reggae thing, you always have to explain it because the cultural formation is so different. You know, the race situation in England is so different because although the English were behind so much slavery, of course, you know, they did this cunning, you know, very clever, sneaky, the English, they kept it offshore. So although you had a few like African individuals, you know, around England, it wasn't a mass thing. In the realities, although there was always some, you know, visitors from abroad and people moving in for whatever, there was only mass diversity in terms of melanin after the war, after the Second World War. That's when the workers were invited from the former colonies. And, you know, they thought Britain was their birthright and their motherland, only to get there and get a bit of a harsh wake-up call. But, you know, it's funny when the races meet, often there's like genocide and real brutality. It seems to be how the humans are. Am I right? I don't mean to be depressing, but it
Yeah.
seems to be.
Well, on that note,